The war had lasted for months. On a distant planet in the galaxy, the humans were fighting against a powerful alien species called the Zyra. The Zyra had been invading human space, destroying everything in their path. The human fleet had tried to stop them, but the aliens were ruthless. The humans had been pushed back to their last stronghold, a barren, rocky world with a cracked surface and endless dust storms. It was on this forsaken planet that the humans made their final stand. The last of their soldiers, including Private Jake Carter, prepared for the worst. Jake had seen many battles, but this one felt different. The Zyra were fierce, and they had the upper hand. The human soldiers had been worn down by months of endless fighting, and hope was running low. Jake stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the battlefield below. The enemy was retreating, but that only meant one thing: they were preparing for something bigger. The Zyra Queen Varya, the leader of the invasion, was not a creature to be underestimated. Her power and her army were vast. If she decided to crush the humans once and for all, there was little they could do to stop her. He could feel the weight of his rifle against his shoulder and the heat of the sun burning through the thin atmosphere. His uniform was dirty and torn. The battle had taken its toll. But there was something inside him, a spark, a flicker of defiance that wouldn't go out. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. In the distance, he saw Hertha Zyra Queen. She was standing tall, her armored form a silhouette against the sky. The queen was no ordinary alien. She was a symbol of fear, a figure of nightmares. Her species was known for their brutal tactics and their ability to destroy entire fleets with ease. Her piercing blue eyes seemed to see through everything, and her presence alone sent shivers down the spine of anyone who crossed her path. The human soldiers around Jake were tense, their rifles aimed at the retreating Zyra, but Jake didn't care about the retreat. His eyes were locked on Queen Varya. "Isn't she beautiful?" Jake muttered to himself, more out of frustration than anything else. The other soldiers were too focused on the battle to hear him. Suddenly, without thinking, Jake shouted, "Hey, beautiful queen." The words were out before he could stop them. The other soldiers looked at him in shock. They were expecting a shout of warning or command, not a flirtatious comment directed at the alien queen. Even Jake himself wasn't sure what had possessed him. Maybe it was the heat of the moment. Maybe it was his own way of saying that he wasn't afraid. The Zyra Queen stopped in her tracks. She turned her head, and for a moment the battlefield fell silent. Jake's heart raced. He had done it. He had gotten her attention. Queen Varya stared at him from across the distance, her expression unreadable. She wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by a human soldier. Her alien soldiers glanced nervously at her, unsure of what to make of Jake's boldness. For a moment, nothing happened. The world stood still. Then, to Jake's surprise, the queen began to move toward him. Her steps were slow, deliberate. With every step, the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of her powerful presence. Her soldiers followed her, but they did not draw their weapons. They, too, were uncertain of what would happen next. Jake didn't know what he had started. He had taunted the most powerful being in the galaxy with nothing more than a bold shout. Now he was waiting to see how she would respond. The soldiers around him were whispering to one another, unsure whether to run or to stand their ground. But Jake didn't move. Couldn't. His eyes were locked on the queen, who was now just a few hundred yards away, as she closed the distance. Jake took a deep breath and held his rifle tighter. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. But he knew one thing. This moment would change everything. Queen Varya stopped, just in front of him. Her eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, looked down at Jake, who still stood firm and unafraid. He couldn't read her face. Was she angry? Amused? Or perhaps curious? He had the courage of a fool. The queen's voice rang out, deep and commanding. It was like the sound of thunder rolling through the sky. Jake didn't flinch. "Maybe," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "But I've seen enough of this war to know that sometimes a fool's courage is the only thing that can make a difference." There was a long silence between them, a moment where both sides seemed to hold their breath. For the first time, Jake felt as though the human side of the battle had some kind of chance. Maybe it was his words, or maybe it was his audacity. But Queen Varya seemed intrigued. She didn't strike him down on the spot. Instead, she simply nodded once, as if acknowledging something. "Is this how humans fight? By taunting their enemies?" she asked, her voice now softer, though still filled with an unmistakable authority. Jake shrugged. You could say it's a human tradition. Varya tilted her head, and for a second, Jake saw something in her eyes, something almost ... human. Then, she turned her gaze back to the battlefield, and the silence was broken once again. Her soldiers began to move into position, but instead of attacking, they waited. The tension was thick, and Jake realized that in this moment, the war had changed. Not because of a weapon or a strategy, but because of a human soldier who had dared to speak out as the queen walked away. Usher. Gaze lingering on Jake for one final moment, he couldn't help but wonder, was this the start of something new? Or had he just signed his own death sentence? Whatever it was, one thing was certain. The galaxy had never seen anything like this before. Jake stood in the middle of the battlefield, his heart pounding as he watched Queen Varya walk away. The ground beneath her feet seemed to quake with each step she took, her armored form a silhouette against the burning sky. Had been ready to attack just moments before, now stood still, waiting for her orders. Jake felt a mix of fear and excitement. He had just challenged the most powerful being in the galaxy, and now all he could do was wait to see what would happen. Next, for a brief moment, everything felt unreal. The sound of blaster fire and explosions had faded, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air. It was as if time itself had stopped. Jake's fellow soldiers watched him from a distance, their eyes wide with disbelief. All heard what he had shouted, but none of them had expected the queen to respond, let alone stop in her tracks. The other Zyra soldiers began to whisper among themselves, exchanging nervous glances. The queen had never been mocked like this before. She was known for her cruelty, her ruthless leadership, and her ability to crush any enemy in her path. The fact that a human soldier had dared to speak to her in such a way was unheard of. Queen Varya stopped walking, her gaze fixed on Jake. Her blue eyes, glowing with an almost otherworldly light, narrowed as she studied him. The air around them seemed to crackle with tension. Every soldier on the field, human and alien alike, held their breath. Unsure of what would happen next, Jake stood tall, refusing to back down. His hands were still gripping his rifle, but he didn't raise it. He knew this was no longer a fight with weapons. It was a test of will, a battle of words. And in that moment, he wasn't sure which one was more dangerous. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Queen Varya spoke, her voice deep and commanding. "You have the audacity to speak to me like that, human? What makes you think you can challenge me with nothing but words?" Jake met her gaze without flinching. "I don't need anything but words to get your attention," he replied, his voice steady. "Sometimes that's all it takes to make a difference." The queen's eyes flickered with something. Was it surprise? Amusement? Jake couldn't tell. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched longer, the weight of her stare almost too much to bear. It was clear that she was deciding whether to show mercy or to destroy him on the spot. For a moment, Jake thought she might order her soldiers to attack. But instead, the queen raised a hand, signaling them to stop. The tension in the air grew heavier as she took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Jake didn't move. He wasn't sure what she was planning, but he had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. Queen Varya stopped, just a few feet in front of him. The force of her presence was overwhelming, and Jake could feel the weight of her power pressing down on him. She looked him over, her gaze piercing through him as if she were studying an insect under a microscope. "You think you are clever?" "Human," she said, her voice almost a growl. "But you are nothing compared to me. You are weak. Your people are weak." Jake didn't flinch. "Maybe," he said, "but we fight. We don't give up. That's something you'll never understand." The queen's eyes flashed with anger, but there was also something else there, something that Jake couldn't quite place. For a moment it seemed as though she was about to speak, but then she simply shook her head. "You are foolish," she said, "but there is something about you. something I cannot ignore. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He couldn't understand why, but the Queen seemed intrigued by him. This was not what he had expected. He had taunted her, mocked her, and now she was standing before him, not attacking, but talking. The silence between them lingered for a few more moments before Varya spoke again. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice softer now. "Why do you fight? Why do your people keep throwing themselves at us, knowing they will lose?" Jake didn't hesitate. "'Cause we have something you don't," he said. Hope that one day we can end this war and build something better. Something more than just destruction." The Queen was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on him. It was clear that Jake's words had made an impact. She had been taught to view humans as weak, as fragile creatures who were no match for the might of the Zyra. But here, standing before her, was a human soldier who seemed to defy everything she had ever known. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze, but he didn't break eye contact. He wasn't sure if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if he had just planted the seeds for something bigger. Varya took a step back, her eyes never leaving him. "You may have courage, human," she said, her voice colder now. "But do not mistake that for strength. One day you will understand that strength is not found in words or hope, but in power." Jake stood tall, his heart still racing, but he refused to back down. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. The Queen turned her back on him. For a moment, Jake thought she was going to leave, but then she paused and looked over her shoulder. "You're lucky," she said. "I do not kill those who amuse me." With that, she turned and walked away, her army following behind her. The battlefield seemed to come alive again, the sounds of gunfire and explosions filling the air. But for Jake, everything had changed. He had survived an encounter with the most powerful being in the galaxy, and somehow he had earned her respect. The battle wasn't over, but Jake had just made sure that the war was far from decided. The battlefield had quieted down after the Queen's departure, but the tension remained. Jake stood where he had been, his rifle hanging loosely in his grip, still processing the strange turn of events. The Zyra soldiers were now retreating, but no one dared to make a move. The Queen had left them with a decision to make, whether to follow her orders or risk disobeying her and facing consequences. Jake's comrades were staring at him, some with looks of disbelief, others with confusion. No one knew what to think. Some whispered that Jake had made a fool of himself, that he had provoked the Zyra Queen and jeopardized their last chance of survival. But there was something else in the air, a kind of cautious hope. If the Queen had spared him, maybe the humans had a shot at peace. Maybe they could end the war without further bloodshed. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by his commander, Captain Lawrence, who walked up to him, his face stern. "What were you thinking, Carter?" Captain Lawrence demanded, his voice low, but firm. "You just insulted the Queen of the Zyra, the most powerful being in the galaxy, and you think that's going to help us?" Jake looked up at the captain, his expression calm despite the tension. "I wasn't trying to insult her. I just spoke my mind. Sometimes that's all we've got left." Captain Lawrence ran a hand over his face, frustration in his eyes. "That's not enough, Carter. You're playing a dangerous game." "I know," Jake said, glancing toward the retreating Zyra forces. "But the Queen, she didn't kill me? That's something?" The captain didn't respond immediately. He looked back at the Zyra, his mind racing as he weighed the options. The Zyra were retreating, yes, but they weren't defeated. Ain't. Words had made an impression on the Queen, but what did that mean for the humans? Did it mean anything at all? Could it mean an opportunity for peace? "What if she's just toying with you?" Captain Lawrence asked, his voice filled with doubt. "What if she's planning something worse?" Jake didn't have an answer. He could feel the weight of the captain's doubt, but there was something in him, a feeling that told him this moment meant more than he could understand. The Queen had been intrigued. And for the first time in the war, Jake felt as though something could change. Before Captain Lawrence could speak again, a voice interrupted them. It was Lieutenant Martin, one of the officers who had been close to Jake during the fighting. "Sir, you need to see this," he said urgently. The captain followed Martin, and Jake, still unsure of what had just happened, followed them. They approached the communications station where the crew was monitoring the situation. A message had just come in from the Zyra. Captain Lawrence stood still, staring at the message for several long seconds before he turned to Jake. "You were right," he said, his voice softer now. "It's from the Queen." The message was a simple one, but it was unlike anything the humans had ever expected. Queen Varya had requested a direct negotiation between her and the human leaders. She was offering a ceasefire, a chance to talk. No demands, no threats, just words. Jake felt a rush of relief. But even in this moment of potential peace, he could not ignore the underlying fear. The Zyra were not known for their mercy, and a ceasefire could be nothing more than a trick. But it was the first real opportunity for diplomacy in the entire war. "You've opened a door," Captain Lawrence said, his gaze flickering between the message and Jake. "Now we have to decide whether we walk through it." Stakes were high. One wrong move could lead to disaster, but the Queen had given them something more valuable than they could have ever imagined: a chance. A chance for dialogue, for understanding, and maybe even for a future where the war didn't define them. As the human commanders discussed the implications of the message, Jake couldn't help but feel a strange sense of responsibility. His words, his daring challenge to the Queen, had led to this moment. He had done something that no one else had dared to do. The Queen had looked at him, not with anger, but with curiosity. And now, a ceasefire was on the table. "You've got guts, Carter," Lieutenant Martin said, giving him a nod of approval. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jake nodded but said nothing. He was still processing what had just happened, still unsure of whether this was the start of something better or just another trap. All he knew was that the war had reached a turning point, and it had happened because of one bold, risky move. Later, that day, a meeting was arranged. The humans would meet with the Zyra under neutral terms. The talks would take place on a station orbiting the planet, where both sides could speak without the threat of immediate violence. It was a fragile situation, and the outcome could go either way. Jake, who had been at the center of it all, found himself torn between hope and fear. Could the Queen's offer be genuine? Was this the beginning of peace, or was it simply another way for the Zyra to regroup and strike again? The humans prepared for the meeting, and Jake stood on the balcony of the base, staring out at the darkened sky. He had no answers, but he knew that his actions had changed something. For better or worse, the Queen had seen him, and she had seen something in him that intrigued her, and so the war paused, if only for a moment. It was a moment that would define the future of humanity, one way or another. The meeting was set. The humans and the Zyra would come together to discuss peace, something no one had ever thought possible. The humans were still on edge, unsure of the Queen's true intentions. The Zyra had never shown mercy before, so why? Would they now? And yet there was a strange sense of hope in the air, something none of the soldiers had felt in a long time. Jake stood with his fellow soldiers in the command center, staring at the holographic display showing the location of the meeting. The humans would be traveling to a neutral station in orbit around the planet, where the talks would take place. No weapons allowed. Felt almost surreal. Captain Lawrence paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back. "We can't afford to be naive about this," he said. "The Zyra Queen may be offering peace, but we can't forget who we're dealing with. If this is some kind of trap, we need to be ready." "I don't think it's a trap," Jake said, speaking more to himself than anyone else. "She could have killed me when I challenged her. But she didn't. She wanted to talk." The captain stopped pacing and turned to face him.
Ow!
"You think she's just playing games with us?" Jake looked down at the floor for a moment, thinking, maybe she's looking for something different. "She's not like the others. I can see it in her eyes." The captain sighed, clearly torn. "I don't like it, Carter. But we don't have many options. If there's even a small chance that this is real, we have to take it." Jake nodded. He wasn't sure about the Queen's true motives, but there was a part of him that wanted to believe. If this meeting led to peace, it would be worth the risk. He had never expected to be part of something like this, a chance to stop the war, to change the course of history. The hour for the meeting finally arrived. The humans, dressed in their formal military uniforms, boarded their transport ship, and headed toward the station. As the ship lifted off, Jake stared out the window, watching the planet shrink beneath them. His mind raced with questions, doubts, and hopes. What would the Queen say? Would she keep her word, or had he just led them into danger? As they neared the neutral station, the communication systems came to life. It was a message from the Zyra, confirming that the Queen was waiting for them in the conference room. The ship docked, and the humans made their way inside, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. The conference room was large and cold, designed for diplomacy rather than comfort. It was empty except for a long table in the center with chairs on either side. Jake's eyes scanned the room, his heart pounding in his chest. This was at the moment that could change everything, and then she entered. Queen Varya stepped into the room, her presence undeniable. The air seemed to hum with energy. As she walked in, her glowing eyes fixed on the humans. She was still the same powerful, intimidating figure Jake had seen on the battlefield. But now, there was something different about her. She wasn't here to fight. She was here to talk. Jake stood at attention, along with the rest of the human delegation. Captain Lawrence nodded to the Queen, signaling that they were ready. The Queen took a seat at the table, her movements smooth and graceful, yet powerful. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting," Captain Lawrence began, his voice steady. "We come in peace, and we hope you are as serious as we are about ending this war." Varya nodded but said nothing. Her eyes lingered on Jake for a moment, and then she looked back at the captain. "The war has lasted long enough," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "But it is not my decision alone. I must convince my people that peace is possible." Jake felt a flicker of hope. This was the Queen he had spoken to on the battlefield, the one who had listened. Maybe she wasn't so different after all. "We want peace," Captain Lawrence said, his voice firm. "But we need guarantees. Your forces have been destroying human colonies for years. How do we know this is real?" The Queen's expression didn't change. "You do not. But you can trust that I want this war to end. I have seen the destruction, and I have seen the pain it causes both our people. I cannot continue down this path." Jake felt his heart beat faster. The words coming from the Queen's mouth were not what he had expected. She was admitting weakness. She was admitting that the war had cost her people as well. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. "You say you want peace?" Jake said, his voice steady. "But why now? Why offer peace when you were so close to victory?" The Queen's eyes flickered as she turned to him. "Because, human," she said, her voice softening slightly, "I realize now that victory without peace is nothing. What use is it to rule over a shattered galaxy?" Jake met her gaze, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time, he saw something other than an enemy in her eyes. He saw a leader who was tired of fighting, a ruler who had seen enough. "Bloodshed. I'm not asking you to trust me completely," she continued. "I am asking for a chance to work together and build something new. It will not be easy. There are many who will oppose this peace, but it is the only way forward." Captain Lawrence nodded, considering her words. "What do you propose?" "A ceasefire," the Queen said, immediate and lasting. "We will stop all military actions on both sides. We will send representatives to discuss terms of a long-term peace treaty. It will take time, but I believe it can be done." Jake could hardly believe what he was hearing. The Queen, the most feared leader in the galaxy, was offering peace. And the humans were actually considering it. "This is more than we could have ever expected," Captain Lawrence said, his voice filled with disbelief. "But it's the only chance we have." Jake turned to the captain, his heart racing. This was happening. This was real. "We accept," Captain Lawrence said, his voice firm. "Let's make peace." The Queen nodded, and for the first time in the war, there was a glimmer of hope. It was a fragile peace, but it was a beginning. Jake stood silently, watching as the Queen and the human delegation shook hands. He had done it. He had stood up to the Queen. And now, a new chapter was beginning. The war wasn't over yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like the humans had a chance. The atmosphere was tense, but filled with a strange sense of possibility. The meeting room on the neutral station was quieter now. the humans and Zyra representatives sitting at the table, each side trying to understand the other. The Queen had made her offer, and Captain Lawrence had accepted it. The ceasefire had begun. Jake stood off to the side, still processing everything that had happened. It felt like a dream, like the war he had fought in for so long was finally coming to an end. But he knew that it wasn't going to be that simple. Peace wouldn't come overnight. There would be many obstacles ahead, and the Queen's proposal had only been the first step. Queen Varia's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood at the head of the table. Her commanding presence still felt, despite the calm in the room. "We have made progress," she said, her tone serious. "But we cannot pretend that this will be easy. My people are not all in favor of peace. There are those who will see my actions as a betrayal." Jake noticed the way her eyes flickered toward her Zyra commanders, who were sitting across from the human leaders. There was tension in the room, and Jake realized just how fragile this moment was. The Queen had risked everything by offering peace. Now she had to convince her own people to follow through. "What happens next?" Captain Lawrence asked. His voice was calm but full of weight. "How do we ensure this ceasefire holds?" "We'll establish a council," Queen Varia explained. "Representatives from both sides will meet regularly to discuss the terms of the treaty and to ensure that neither side breaks the ceasefire. It will be difficult, but I believe it is the only way forward." Jake felt a small flicker of hope. The war was far from over, but at least there was a plan, a chance for something better. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. The Queen wasn't just offering peace for the sake of peace. She was taking a huge risk, and Jake couldn't help but wonder why. "Why are you doing this?" Jake found himself asking. His voice was uncertain, but the question had been on his mind for hours. Why offer peace now? Why not just finish the war? "You had us on the ropes?" Queen Varia turned to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You still don't understand, do you, human?" she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Victory means nothing if the galaxy is nothing but ashes. We have fought long enough. My people have paid the price of this war, and I have seen enough." There was something in her eyes, a hint of weariness that Jake hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just a powerful alien queen. She was a ruler who had been carrying the weight of an entire species. Her actions weren't just about power. They were about survival, for her people and for herself. Jake stepped forward, his curiosity taking over. "But why us? Why now?" Queen Varia's gaze softened, just slightly. "You humans, ... You have a stubbornness about you. I have watched you fight for your survival, against all odds. I thought you were weak, but I was wrong. You are strong, and I admire that." Jake blinked in surprise. He had never expected to hear such words from her. For the first time, he saw her not just as an enemy, but as someone who was looking for a way out of the endless cycle of war. "Do you think peace is possible?" he asked, his voice low. Varia's eyes met his. "I hope so," she said quietly. "But it will not be easy. My people have been raised on the belief that the Zyra are meant to rule, that we are superior. Letting go of that belief will take time, may take generations." The weight of her words hit Jake hard. He'd never thought of the war in those terms before. To the Zyra, it wasn't just about territory or resources. It was about something much deeper, their very identity, their belief that they were meant to dominate the galaxy. "I don't expect you to trust me completely," Varia continued, "but I am offering you a chance. A chance to build something better, something beyond war. It is not just your fight, it is mine too."
How?
Jake stood still, taking in everything she had said. Queen wasn't just trying to end the war, she was trying to change everything. She was offering peace, but it came with a cost that neither side could avoid. The war had shaped both of their peoples in ways that couldn't be undone overnight. It would take more than just a ceasefire to create lasting peace. "Is this your final decision?" Captain Lawrence asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but Jake could hear the hesitation in it. "Are you truly committed to this?" Varia nodded. "Yes. I will do everything in my power to see this through, but I need your help. Both of our people need to want this peace. If we are to survive as more than just enemies, we must work together." Room was silent as the humans and Zyra representatives exchanged looks. It was clear that they were all weighing the Queen's words, trying to decide if they could truly trust her.
Ow.
The risks were enormous, but the potential reward was just as great. Jake glanced at his fellow soldiers, their faces a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. For the first time in years, it felt like they were on the verge of something new, something better. "We accept your offer, Captain," Lawrence said, his voice firm. "We will work with you to make this peace a reality." Arya gave a slight nod, her expression unreadable. But for a moment, there was something in her eyes that almost resembled relief. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Jake stood in the back of the room, his heart racing. He had come to this meeting expecting to fight, to face the Queen across a battlefield once again. But now, he found himself in the middle of something much bigger, something that could change the future of both their peoples. The war was far from over, but it had taken a turn. The chance for peace was real. No one knew what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, Jake believed it was possible. The days after the ceasefire began were strange, full of uncertainty and change. The human soldiers who had been at war for so long were still adjusting to the idea of peace. There were still many questions, fears, and doubts. Zyra had stopped fighting, but what did that really mean? Could they trust the Queen? Could they trust each other? Jake walked through the corridors of the human base, his thoughts heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The war that had defined his life was over, at least for now. But the peace that was supposed to replace it felt fragile, like a thin thread that could snap at any moment. He couldn't stop thinking about the Queen's words. She had offered peace. But what if it was just another trick? What if the Zyra were only waiting for the right moment to strike? "Jake, you look like you've seen a ghost," a voice said from behind him. Jake turned to see Lieutenant Martin, one of the soldiers who had been with him from the beginning. Martin was grinning, but Jake could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm just thinking," Jake said, his voice low, "about everything that's happened. The war, the ceasefire, the Queen. It feels like too much all at once." Martin nodded. "Yeah, I get it. We've been fighting for so long, it's hard to imagine what life will be like without it. But you've got to admit, things are looking better than they have in a long time." Jake sighed and leaned against the wall. "I don't know. I can't shake the feeling that we're being set up for something." Martin's expression softened. "I know it's hard to trust the Zyra, but after everything, maybe it's time to give peace a chance." Jake was quiet for a moment, staring at the floor. "You think the Queen really wants peace?" "I do," Martin said firmly. "I saw it in her eyes. She's tired of the war. She's tired of seeing her people suffer. I don't think she's lying." Jake looked up at Martin, considering his words. He wanted to believe. He really did. But the war had been so brutal, so relentless, that it was hard to imagine peace as anything more than a temporary pause in the violence. "You're right," Jake said finally. "I don't know what will happen. But if the Queen is serious about peace, then we need to be serious too." Martin gave him a smile. "Exactly. Can't just sit around waiting for something to go wrong. We need to make this work." The two soldiers stood there for a while, neither one knowing what to say next. It was strange to think about the future without the constant threat of battle. For so long, every day had been about surviving the next fight. Now, they had to learn to live without it. Later that evening, there was an unexpected announcement. The human delegation, including Captain Lawrence and other high-ranking officers, was to meet with the Zyra leadership once more. The ceasefire had held, and it was time to begin formal discussions about the terms of the peace treaty. It wasn't just about stopping the fighting. It was about creating a new future for both species. Jake couldn't help but feel nervous. He wasn't sure what to expect from the meeting, but he knew that it would be a turning point. If the negotiations went well, they could finally put the war behind them. If they failed, it could all come crashing down. The next morning, Jake and the other soldiers arrived at the conference room on the neutral station. It was a large, cold space designed for diplomacy rather than comfort. The walls were bare, and the long table in the center of the room felt imposing. as though it was meant to remind everyone of the seriousness of the situation. Jake sat quietly, his eyes scanning the room. The Zyra representatives were all ready. They're waiting. Queen Varia was seated at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jake's gaze met hers, and he saw something there that he hadn't expected: uncertainty. The Queen was just as unsure of this peace as he was. Maybe even more. Captain Lawrence stood and addressed the room, his voice steady. Today, we begin the process of creating a lasting peace. We have all fought too long, and we've all lost too much. But today, we have the chance to build something new, something better. We are here to negotiate terms, to find a way forward together. There was a long silence as everyone took in his words. The human commanders exchanged nervous glances, and the Zyra officers looked tense. Jake could feel the weight of the moment. In the air, as though one wrong word could shatter everything, Queen Varia finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. We have agreed to this peace, but we know that it will not be easy. There are those among my people who still believe that the war is necessary. It will take time to convince them that peace is the only way forward. Jake watched as the Queen's eyes shifted to her own people, who sat in silence. It was clear that she was leading them into unknown territory, just as the humans were. I understand, Captain Lawrence replied. We all have our doubts. But we are willing to work with you. We want this peace as much as you do. The Queen nodded slowly. Then let us begin. Over the next few hours, the two sides discussed terms. There were many challenges to overcome, but both sides were determined to make it work. There were agreements on trade, security, and rebuilding efforts. There were even talks of cultural exchange, something no one had ever thought possible between the humans and Zyra. Jake sat quietly, listening to the negotiations. It was hard to believe that this was happening. For so long, he had only known war. Now, he was witnessing the beginning of something entirely new. When the meeting was finally over, Captain Lawrence turned to the human delegation with a tired but hopeful expression. We've taken the first steps, he said. It's not over, but it's a start. Jake looked out at the stars through the window of the conference room. The war had been long and painful, but maybe, just maybe, the future didn't have to be. They had a chance now, a real chance. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a glimmer of hope.